what we have here is a completely normal language textbook for a completely normal language. But the advice I'm about to give you is wildly abnormal, is totally unlike anything you're going to hear on YouTube, or I think anything you're going to find via the internet, as it has now been restructured and reordered by social media. It's a normal textbook. It's got cartoons. It's got an audio CD. It's got lists of vocabulary. It's got little songs for you to sing. Really, in this case, it's Chinese, but it's not so different from a textbook you might have for any other language. Right now, I'm helping my girlfriend learn Chinese, and she's starting from a beginner's level. What's the best possible advice I could give her on how to start with this textbook? Turn to the appendix, tear it out of the book, write out the entire list of vocabulary, and memorize every single word before you start on page 1 of chapter 1. I doubt that any university professor has ever suggested this to you, any high school teacher, any internet personality who's out here peddling advice on how to make learning languages quick and easy and fun and painless. And that's the problem. Learning languages is not quick, it's not easy, it's not fun, and it's not painless. I have many years of experience with learning and teaching languages, and I now have many years of experience watching the myth-making process that goes on here on YouTube. And what's interesting to me is, parallel to the fitness world, people giving you advice on how to lose body fat and gain muscle, the vast majority of people who are selling you myths of fast and easy language learning, they don't make any money out of it. They're not selling you an application, they're not selling you a book, they're not selling you a course. Most of the time, they don't even have a website. Most of the time, they're not even making really any money out of YouTube. They're just giving you, they're telling you what you want to hear. You don't want to hear that gaining muscle at the gym is going to be physically painful and physically exhausting. That it's going to ruin your night's sleep, make you wake up feeling like crap. That you're going to be standing at your job with unbelievable pain in your back, in your arms, in your legs. That you're going to literally collapse on the floor of the gym and lie there out of breath. Nobody wants to hear that. And indeed, even in video format here on YouTube, most of the time, you don't see that. I had a few little anecdotal encounters with people recently that reminded me of this side of the fitness game and how rare it is for people to even be honest about it when they're talking about their own process of how they lost weight, how they gained muscle, etc., just omitting pain. Just omitting lost nights of sleep when you couldn't sleep well because of muscle stiffness or muscle. All that stuff is left out. And there's a really odd comparison to be made here, because one of the most compelling myths in language teaching and language acquisition is ultimately what we would call a naturalistic fallacy. Now, not all uses of the concept of nature are fallacious. But suppose someone were to say to you, the best way for you to lose body fat and gain muscle is to hike up and down mountains and to climb trees and to walk around in the forest carrying a bow and arrow and shoot the bow and arrow at things, because that's what our ancient ancestors did. That's natural. You might find that convincing. You might look at the unnatural steel cage at your gym and suddenly feel like the veil has been lifted from your eyes. This is some kind of perverse postmodern concoction that in no way can compare to the historical genetic experience of our ancestors over millions of years. Maybe you decide that you should go back to the jungle, go back to the forest, climb mountains and climb trees, and see what kind of results you can get. The thing is, if you do this for just 3 months or 6 months, it's going to be very obvious to you very quickly, because it's empirically visible that the results you're getting are not nearly as good as what you could have achieved in the same amount of time and the same amount of effort using that steel cage and those heavy weights, those unnatural cultural and scientific accretions that people have figured out for how to lose body fat and how to gain muscle mass. What I hear and see again and again here on YouTube, and yes, I've dealt with it face-to-face with people in real life, is that the natural way to learn language is to imitate what babies and toddlers do. Because what babies and toddlers do is supposedly fun and effortless compared to this. Now, there's a lot wrong with this appeal to nature fallacy, including the way in which it's used as an excuse or a pretext to recommend that you do the types of low-effort, self-indulgent activities that you as a YouTube viewer may already be inclined to want to make excuses for doing anyway. So I see protracted, methodologically sophisticated discussions of how the best way to acquire a new piece of vocabulary is this: hand. Hand. The same way a little baby is shown a hand and is told the word hand repeatedly, that you're going to pick this up in your second language or third language, whatever it is you're studying, that this is somehow infinitely better than working with unnatural methods like the steel cage in the gym, more discursive and analytical methods that involve reading and discussion and learning and repetition and what have you. And here's the thing. If you pick up vocabulary the way a 5-year-old does, hand. How do you now interpret the word hand when I give you the following sentence? Economic development and political liberalization go hand in hand. You may not realize it, but from a 5-year-old's perspective, that's really baffling. 5-year-olds don't talk that way. Even most 10-year-olds, who by that point will have had more than 5 years of formal education and enormous hours of informal education you can't possibly reproduce as an adult, more on that later, they don't talk that way. They can't read and easily understand language communication that way. They haven't been taught the range of idiomatic and just syntactically complex ways in which we actually use the concept of hand. And if you think English is the most difficult language in the world for this, you're dead wrong. It gets way harder, and there are all kinds of examples that are even outside of the scope of what you can find in dictionaries if you're using modern and discursive methods. If you really wanted to reproduce the natural form of learning a language the way a toddler does or the way a young school child does, would you be interested in employing an elderly woman to live in your apartment with you and to pretend to be your grandmother? An old woman who forces you to do household chores and step by step corrects you whenever you say the wrong word, forces you to say banal sentences back and forth with her, who is spooning you, tofu, and is saying to you again and again, tofu, no, tofu. Giving you this kind of experience with an elderly parental figure. I've lived in countries like Laos and Cambodia where this really is the main way that language is communicated between the generations. And in some respects, those cultures are very pure examples of this, grandparent to grandchild language transmission, because the grandparents often have zero formal education and even zero literacy. You have illiterate grandparents who are putting in long hours of repeating simple words and phrases to young children. But again, guess what the results are? After thousands of hours of language immersion, by age 10, they can barely string together a sentence like a lisping 10-year-old. If you're starting now at age 30, or even if you're watching this video and you're age 15, after 5 years of spending hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, intensively studying a language and an enormous amount of money paying for teachers of different kinds, you do not want to be at the level of sophistication and language ability that is achieved by a child after 5 years of learning those methods. And if you really started to make an inventory of how infants, small children, and young school children learn their first language, let alone a second language, If you start putting together the number of hours of the day that are really spent in language practice of various kinds, it's going to start to dawn on you just how many people you're going to have to pay how much money to play some kind of parenting or grandparenting role in helping you through this. But coming back to the comparison with lifting weights at the gym in a steel cage, as opposed to going out in the wilderness, climbing up a mountain, gaining muscle the natural way. The naturalistic fallacy, the appeal to nature, the idea that you should do things in the most natural way possible. With fitness, this encounters a limit because the results are empirically obvious. You can take off your shirt and look in the mirror and see how you're doing, and you might be able to compare yourself to your brother or your cousin and what results he's getting at the gym, etc., etc. And with language, those comparisons are not obvious. They're very difficult for you to perceive yourself. They're difficult for other people to perceive, measure, or even grade you on. And it's incredibly easy for you to lie to yourself and mislead yourself and imagine that you're making much more progress in the language than you actually are. Guys, I'm going to keep this video short. I sincerely do not know if I'm going to put my girlfriend through the agony of rote memorization of several hundred words of raw vocabulary before she starts on page 1, chapter 1 of this textbook. It's not fun. It's not easy. It's not natural. Did I ever do that when studying a language? Yes, I did. I studied a language very few Western people study that's called Pali, P-A-L-I, and I was highly motivated to study that language even though I had no teacher and in a sense I had no textbooks. Leave that aside. And I decided that with all three of the textbooks I used starting off, textbooks I to some extent had to rewrite and reformat myself and post on the internet myself, put together bits and pieces or typed out from old printed copies I'd found in Sri Lanka, long story, was putting together my own educational materials on this and indeed typing out the entire textbook myself. This is already a significant form of language practice most people would never engage in. And of course, I had to type out the entire index, the index of vocabulary at the back as an appendix. And I decided I'm going to memorize every single word. And in some cases, they were both words and word forms. So that's like not just the word, but also a common ending, like with an ing ending on it, that kind of thing. Before I start on page 1, chapter 1 of this textbook. And you know what that allows you to do? It means that when you're reading specific examples, your limited time, energy, and focus is going into the heart of the language exercise instead of just struggling to remember or remind yourself or figure out basic items of vocabulary. So you have a sentence like, the man walked down the road from the hillside until he came to the side of a certain tree. Let's say it's a persimmon tree. So when I looked at a sentence like that, I'm able to focus on the relationships between the words, the grammar, figuring out, so he's coming down the hill or is he going up the hill? I already recognize all the basic words, hill, walk, tree. I probably will not know persimmon. I probably won't recognize the type of tree it is. I can look that up in a dictionary or not because I'm still understanding most of the sentence. What I'm doing with the language exercise, reading, writing, and practice is profoundly different because I went through this unnatural, heavy lifting process of preparation of memorizing the vocabulary. And I noticed something. I taught myself that language while being very busy with a number of full-time jobs, while studying other languages like Thai and Laotian, which are members of a completely different language family, while being busy with all the regular things of doing my dishes and taking a shower and going to the gym. I really didn't have that much time to kill. But in maybe 2 years, I had learned much more of that language than any of the people with PhDs in the field whom I met. And I was able to look at complex statements about philosophy in the language and have a huge advantage, partly just because I was starting on the basis of rote memorization of vocabulary, and then I built on top of that the ability to practice what you might call the more sophisticated issues of syntax, grammar, just trying to get the whole meaning of a sentence out of the ways in which the different words are juxtaposed. And let me tell you something. When you've already got all 6 meanings of the word hand memorized, then it's very different when you see in a peculiar context a usage like economic development and political progress go hand in hand. You're starting from a sophisticated discursive knowledge of the range of possible meanings, an explanation maybe also of how in some contexts this is a verb, in some contexts it's a noun, etc., etc. You're starting from an unnatural, artificial, scientific, sophisticated knowledge of how the word is used in the language that indeed a 10-year-old doesn't have, a 5-year-old doesn't have, a toddler or a baby doesn't have, that the majority of people never develop in their first language, but that empowers you as a rational, thinking, intelligent adult to make rapid progress much, much more quickly than a native speaker does between age 0 and age 10. This is the advice that nobody wants to hear.